Today we're going to talk a little bit about due diligence and, as a seller, what you can expect, and for the buyers in the room, kind of walk you through a sample due diligence process. A little bit on me, the Director of Operations at Centurica, been there since 2015, and have conducted due diligence on over $50 million of online business transactions. We help mainly buyers, but we do work with sellers as they're preparing their businesses for sale, and they want kind of before they go to market, a due diligence check to reveal any potential issues. I have experience on paid search, SEO, and have managed a portfolio of e-commerce and content websites myself. So when we talk about due diligence, we generally are speaking from the time after an LOI has been signed to the time of closing. And during that phase, which can range from maybe 1 to 2 weeks on the shorter end to 6 to 8 months, as some of our speakers said earlier, on the longer time frame, there's going to be a whole lot going on, right? The goal there is for us to verify all the information that's been presented. The offers that a buyer's made on a business is based on what you've claimed. But during due diligence, our goal and the buyer's goal is to verify all of that information to the best of their ability. We also want to identify potential risk and assess opportunities. Are there any risks that haven't been disclosed to us that we can uncover by diving into the business? I like to say that a buyer who's done a good job in due diligence should almost have a better understanding of the business than the seller by the end of it. That means you're in a good position to close and to continue operating that business post-closing. And for those of you that are just operators in the room, you're not thinking of selling your business yet, I think that understanding what it means to be ready to sell and operating your business as if you're going to sell it tomorrow means that you have a more valuable business right now, and it opens up possibilities long term. So even though you might not be actively buying or selling, the criteria that we're looking for and the issues that we uncover, I think can help you run your business more efficiently and run a more valuable business long term. And so when we head into due diligence, we break it down into a couple of key phases. There's going to be a bunch of people involved in the process, and we like to keep it organized and start with a big kickoff meeting. There might be 5 or 6 people on a phone call, and we're going to kick off between the buyer and the seller, and the buyer is going to ask for a list of information. A general list might be 30 or 40 different requests that we're going to ask the seller to prepare. And we're going to do that all at once so that they have, they know what's expected and they can start collecting it as soon as possible. One thing that I think kills due diligence processes is when a buyer is sending over an email every 3 hours. I thought of this, can you send me that? Right? Keeping it all organized and in an efficient and organized manner moving forward is going to make sure that you don't miss something and you move through the steps in a methodical process. After we get all of the information that we're looking for, we're going to start with financials. Because if the financials don't line up, the marketing and the growth could be there, but if the numbers don't match what someone's claimed, the deal's probably not going to happen. And so we're going to go ahead and rebuild the P&L line by line. We're going to request credit card statements, bank accounts, merchant account access, 1099s, tax returns, as much information as we can get to verify and rebuild the P&L. After that, if everything's lined up, we'll move on to operations and marketing reviews. And so in operations, the buyer is trying to get a sense of how you as the seller run your business day to day. This can be done over a series of in-person meetings, phone calls, video calls, interviews with your team members. The buyer doesn't know all of the knowledge that's in your head, right? Many of you have been running businesses for 3, 5, 10 years. And in your mind, people are like, what do you do? Oh, I go in, I check some emails, I send a couple things, I tell this guy to do this, and the day's over and, we make great money. But to the buyer, they have no idea. They've been running your business for 0 days. And so breaking things out, task by task, hour by hour, team member by team member is really important. And it's something that I see sellers struggle to do all of the time. And so I found that it's helpful for sellers to walk through a process, right? Walk through a product launch process. Walk through a new sales lead from the entrance into the pipeline to closing so that buyers can get a better understanding of what you're actually doing day to day. If you have no idea what you're doing day to day, you can try some time tracking softwares or things like that to try and get an idea of what a typical week looks like for you. Once we get through operations, we might move into sales and marketing. Here we're going to be trying to understand the key metrics, like what's driving this business? Where do the growth, where does the sales come from? Is it Google AdWords? Is it a key sales rep? Is it an industry referral relationship? and trying to understand how sustainable those channels are for the business, right? If they can't transfer, if a new buyer doesn't have a skill set to fulfill those channels and to run them, that's probably not the business for them. Then we'll move into transition planning, which Chuck talked a lot about. We need to make sure that items can transition to a new business entity or a new owner. And there's a couple issues that can come up there when you think about new entities, when you move from different ad accounts or payment processors. So making sure that that's all claimed. A seller might have said, oh, this can transfer no problem. But when we actually read the contract, when we get on the phone with the supplier, all of those things need to be checked, because the worst thing that could happen would be, day 2, you're running the business and your supplier calls and says, hey, we can't sell to you, or we can't sell to you at this price anymore. So everything that the seller said, we're going to take them at their word, but in due diligence, we actually have to go through and verify line by line. It's a tedious process. As a seller, I can promise you it's not going to be fun, but hopefully we can keep it organized and thorough, and so that you can get through to the other end where both parties are comfortable. One of the final steps that we'll do is as we're working through due diligence, we're going to be keeping a list of little opportunities we see along the way. And our goal at the end is to help put together a growth plan for a buyer so that they can see, here's what opportunities I can tackle 30, 60, 90, 180 days into the process. And then we'll help through closing, getting everything actually transferred over, moving bank accounts, updating payment information. Again, just making sure that, while we think those transitions can happen, that they actually do. There's a lot of people involved in this process. It's going to depend on the deal, the specifics, but obviously there's going to be a buyer and a seller. They might each have representatives. There are going to be lawyers and accountants on both sides, and there might be subject matter experts that are brought in. I will say one thing, having working on hundreds of due diligence processes, that lawyers and accountants are awesome. They're really good at spending, hours working on problems with these deals. But as a buyer and seller, you have to be, the coach. You have to be the quarterback of this process and tell them where you feel you want them to be working at. What are the risks? What are the challenges? What are the items you want them to address? Because if you don't tell them anything, they might just end up spinning their wheels on something that really doesn't matter to you and miss an opportunity or something that you wanted to be addressed in the paperwork that they didn't even think to do because they didn't have experience or subject matter expertise. Any questions so far? Great, we can keep moving. Yeah?
Better off on, as a seller, negotiating on your own, or having somebody, a company or individual, somebody who does that, negotiate for you?
Would you recommend having someone negotiate for you is the question? I think it's going to depend on your relationship with the other party. I've always found that having someone else play the bad cop can be a good thing. It preserves that relationship long term. And so when we're working through due diligence, a couple of the most important items that we're going to do where we find problems is, number one, not only reviewing the P&L and making sure that all of the common categories are present, right? If you see an e-commerce business and all of a sudden there's no advertising spend, but they're receiving a bunch of traffic from channels that are called Google Ads, you want to ask where that is, right? Sometimes sellers are doing their own books and they've lumped it into another category. Other times, we've seen stuff be left off P&Ls all the time. So just making sure that your common categories are there and that you break items down, line by line. And we'll even go a step further on businesses, and we'll break items, the P&L down at a SKU level to understand what are the specific trends of individual SKUs. A lot of Amazon businesses or other e-commerce businesses have one or two items that are, 30, 40, 50% of their revenue. So understanding the trends of those items are so important to the value of the business, not just looking at it in aggregate, but looking at each individual item. Other things we'll do is break out key metrics, right? So here we're looking at the percentage of cost of goods sold over the overall revenue. We're looking at Amazon fees and what those average. And so, looking year over year and looking at those numbers, over a period of time can be insightful to say, oh, our cost of goods are rising, or Amazon fees are going up, cost of advertising is going up, which helps you make an informed decision about the future of the business. One common question we get is, what tools do we use in due diligence? And we use, hundreds of tools, and at the end of the slideshow, I'll share a list to probably 60 or so tools that we use commonly. But I think that people a lot of times forget that these business transactions, they're still human interactions. They're people selling, they're people buying. And there are, more times than I would like to admit that we've gotten 2 weeks into due diligence with someone and, they're buying an e-commerce business, and I ask them what they think of the product, and they haven't purchased the product from the company, the $1 million business they're about to buy, and they haven't purchased that product yet. They haven't ever been to the website and signed up for their email newsletter. They've never talked to customer support, right? They haven't interviewed any of the employees. And so making sure that you remember that, yes, tools and metrics and trends are awesome, but there's a human side to all of this, and that type of due diligence I think is going to be more valuable than any tool you can use to give your Amazon a 1 to 10 rating, or any item you can look at in Google Ads to say this account's underperforming and we estimate we can optimize performance by 10%, right? So understanding that there are human sides of things here that you should be conducting due diligence on, that I think are fairly easy to do. They don't take that much time, but they actually allow you to get to know the product a lot better than some of the other tools and checks out there. And so I want to talk through a couple of common issues that we see in due diligence. There's tons of issues. I would say that it's very rare that we ever get through a 3 or 4 week process with someone when we're working with them to acquire a business, and there's nothing that's come up, right? If there's nothing that has come up, we probably didn't do our job digging deep enough. All small businesses, I think, have things that keep people up at night. They have potential risk, and so it's making sure that you can identify them, that and can understand the risk. But here are a couple of common ones that we see that cause frustrations or challenges when we work through deals. So the first one is a lack of bookkeeping or accounting. And Chuck touched on this earlier, but there are so many businesses, $1 million businesses that don't have any accounting software. If you have one of those, Xero is right over there. They would love to talk to you. Making sure that items are verifiable, that you can actually look back and say, why was this in this category? What was this transaction related to? Is so important. So many times when people are doing their own books, they miss an item, or maybe they've commingled their books and they've got 3 businesses and it's not clear how they want to break out. They've got a certain software subscription, or they've got advertising spend spread across 3 different businesses. Breaking that out is going to take a lot more time, and it's going to make buyers a little bit uneasy. So keeping things clean, keeping things separate bank account, separate entity, separate credit card, separate ad account, separate Amazon account, all of that is going to be really helpful. And if you can, hire a bookkeeper, hire someone to manage that process for you, so that you're a little removed from it and they can kind of handle, and the experts can take care of a lot of it. The second issue we see is undisclosed violations or warnings. And this is, I think, like I said earlier, no business is perfect. We've all had issues, right? Maybe a business has had a Google penalty and traffic drop, but it recovered. Maybe you were buying a bunch of reviews on Amazon, but have stopped that now. Those things happen, and a lot of these businesses have them. The issue comes when you don't talk about it and you're not upfront with a buyer, right? If you get 3 weeks into due diligence and all of a sudden you find something that's an issue, then the buyer starts questioning, well, what else haven't you told me? And so understanding as a seller, you need to be upfront about all of that information to make sure that people are aware of it, and people can then justify it and get over the risk in their head until you get to the 11th hour and it kills the deal. Transferability issues, this is one we see with a lot of e-commerce companies where you have you're allowed to drop ship or distribute an item. Recently we had a business that was moving to a different state, but the distributor wasn't willing to open any new accounts in that state, so all of a sudden that business couldn't transfer. You see this with Etsy accounts, once in a while with Amazon accounts. They're hard to transfer sometimes, and so making sure all of that's lined up beforehand, that you've talked to your suppliers and your employees, and so that things can transfer smoothly. Legal and tax issues, I'm not an accountant, I'm not a lawyer. I would advise you all to consult with them, but we see issues with sales tax and sales tax nexus with e-commerce businesses. States are getting more aggressive, and if you're buying an e-commerce business, some states can actually come after a new owner of a business that has existing tax liabilities that haven't been paid. So checking on that, making sure you can work through that with the seller. And so if you are selling, making sure that all of those taxes are registered properly and you're collecting taxes where you should be will alleviate some of those issues when you work through them in due diligence. And a couple of other legal issues we've seen lately, having to do with trademarks, is that factories overseas and suppliers overseas have actually started to trademark American brand names and register a trademark, overseas in China, and they've actually been able to kind of hold that American brand hostage as they go to ship items. They can actually hold shipments and negotiate and try and get them to switch their suppliers, to the company in China that's registered their trademark. And that's happened 5 or 6 times within the last few months. So if you are selling, you are an established brand, I would recommend at least doing a search overseas, registering your trademarks in Europe and anywhere else where there might be potential risk. That's going to add value to the business long term. And the most common due diligence issue here is the loss of trust. All of those issues that I mentioned beforehand, I think all of those can be resolved by working and being upfront and kind of open between the buyer and the seller. But as soon as one party loses trust, right, the seller says, I don't actually think this guy is realistic about buying my business. The buyer says, I don't think the seller's actually telling me the information that I'm asking for. I think they're holding something back. I think that is the number one killer of deals that we see. I think that brokers and intermediaries can play a role there to make sure that doesn't happen, right? A broker should start to sense that we have an issue between the two parties. We need to get everyone on the phone. We need to talk this out. We need to provide more information so that we don't get to the point where there's a loss of trust between the parties, because we're probably not going to recover from that. A couple of key tips here: let someone else represent your interest. A lot of times as the seller, you're going to have to work with that buyer for the next 6 months, the next year, depending on your terms and seller note. And so let someone else do some of that negotiation so that you're not jeopardizing your strong relationship with the buyer. You should be friendly and remain on good terms, because you're going to have to work with them for a while. I would also recommend maintaining open and constant communication, right? Set up a weekly phone call, work through the process together so that there aren't things that come up where you don't go silent for 2 weeks and no one knows what anyone's working on. And I would also prepare for potential issues, right? Everyone knows that businesses aren't perfect, that this is hard to do. The buyer is trying to answer the question, what keeps you up at night as a seller, right? Why are you selling this? Why are you, what are you scared of? And so how can you preempt those questions and answer them for people so that you're able to give them comfort, right? If everything is just kind of rose-colored, they're not going to believe you, and they're going to say, what is this guy hiding? What is kind of wrong with this business? But if you share things that have worked, things that haven't worked in the past, I think that they'll understand that that's a more realistic view of a lot of these businesses. A couple of resources here. The Flippa blog does a great job outlining kind of a due diligence checklist. I put together a list of tools and a kind of a process workflow that we use. That's at tinyurl.com/flippatheexit. And then for those of you that like podcasts, the e-commerce crew podcast number 274, we talked with Mike Jackness about how due diligence helped him sell his business on the seller side.